Hi, my name is Alexis Gannis, and today I will be presenting on lesbian poetry, the characteristics of queer and lesbian poetry, and written works. As a brief introduction, I'd like to introduce the main frame of analysis I'll be using. Author Paula Bennett contributed a chapter in the book Professions of Desire, Lesbian and Gay Studies in Literature, where she speaks about several topics. The main area of focus I will pontificate on during this presentation are her definitions of lesbian poetry as a genre, how lesbian authors have been able to insert themselves, as well as areas where they have been prevented from inserting themselves, as well as delving into four classifications of lesbian poetry and their characteristics. Once the groundwork of Bennett's contributions have been laid, I will further explain how authors listed on this slide here, as you can see above, from our class readings have reinforced and or juxtaposed the central themes of Bennett's piece, as well as analyzed their work. The first area that I'm going to touch on is both chronologically relevant to the reading, but is also an important first step for providing a foundation for the concepts I will touch on later. So first, it's important to establish, is lesbian poetry even a genre? The first thing that author Paula Bennett dives into is what lesbian poetry is, or rather, if lesbian poetry is even a thing at all. With a lot of diction used by someone who clearly has indeed read a lot of poetry, Bennett delves into what defines genres and if lesbianism is enough of an influence to get its own space in the analogs of poetic history. Bennett would argue, as she does, that there is enough evidence that it should be considered its own genre. She makes the argument that if one of the characteristics of well-recognized and appreciated poetry is the diction and artistic direction, and if erotic and emotional sentiments make for the most moving forms of literature, then surely sexual orientation of the author will drive the works they produce. In this way, she argues that lesbianism is a basis for categorizing the works of women authors, therefore it is a basis for categorizing poetry in a genre of its own. The next major point that Bennett makes is how using lesbianism as a genre highlights some of the most prominent voices throughout the history of poetry. She makes the immediate connection to authors such as Marianne Moore, Gwendolyn Brooks, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton, a few of whom we'll be talking about later, but also makes a point to include the works of other women presumed to have sexualities that line up with, being attracted to women. Some of the other women that she mentions are also incredibly prominent, like Emily Dickinson, Amy Lowell, Gertrude Stein, among many others that make up the feminist voices found in our history. These same women have been ascribed to the genre of lesbian poetry, as Bennett describes. This is an incredibly substantial argument about the powerful influence of lesbianism as a contributor to art and poetry, and the argument that lesbianism lends itself to the versatile nature of poetry is something that we will explore shortly. What Bennett writes about next, however, briefly, is important to consider as a juxtaposition to what we were just talking about. Bennett makes the connection that the bountiful nature of lesbianism and queerness that is found in the most famous women poets is countered by the presumed lacking of lesbian novelists. Virtually all of the famous women authors whose contributions to the world of novels carries on forever were most certainly straight. When breaking down the reasons why this is the case, Bennett makes a compelling argument. The types of literature, storylines, and plots that construct the basis of the novels that have gone down in history are not conducive to the nature of queerness before modern acceptance of queerness. What I mean by this, and what Bennett means by this, is that the storylines in famous books written by women almost always include what she references as, quote, "reader, I married him," end quote. The women characters in the plot, the plot involves fall in love and either marry, die trying, or forced apart. It all focuses around that central love story theme. The idea that love stories and tales of marriages and romance dominated the genre of works and novels written by women is the light in which it's important to frame off the authors themselves. The lust, longing, stories, laughter, and heartbreak that these authors were able to write so deeply and convincingly about that their words have been left highlighted in the analogs of history are so revered because these emotions have been felt deeply by the women writing the words, just as deeply as the characters that they are meant to be experiencing them. The nature of emotions and literature are so intertwined that the most compelling works, even in fiction, lie somewhere close to reality in the emotions that they can inspire from their readers. The proverbial marriage story and even the love, meet, cute, lighthearted romances have historically been reserved for heterosexual men and women. This straights-only parking for female novelists exists because of the social and political nature of homosexuality and queerness. There's no reason to believe, though, that lesbian novelists are any less skilled, intelligent, or enjoyable than any other sexual orientation. But the lack of safety in public spaces and even acceptance due to the inability to get legally married throughout history has made stories of queer marriages impossible, which alienates queer women from these spaces, reserved for novelists and storytellers. Within the breadth of lesbian poetry, Bennett breaks the genre up into four main periods, each with their own characterizations and qualities that I'm going to explain right now. The first of these periods, Bennett explains, is the early modernist romantic, which I will, for everyone's sake, refer to as EMR for this presentation because it's just so much faster. This piece explains this period of being the earliest lesbian poems. Bennett analyzes them as a pouring out, unrestrained, homosexual, homoerotic romanticism. This means that diction comprising EMR poems was incredibly passionate, sentimental, and feminine. The use of Sappho and biblical undertones characterized many of the pieces of lesbian poetry during the early modernist romantic periods. These poems became the original basis for what later authors consider wildly romantic language, wildly romantic love. The metaphors, similes, and other stylistic devices were used to express longing and sensuality. However, the nature of their works, their authors, and their content leads EMR authors to become the most wildly expected and accepted form of lesbian poetry. To counteract this stereotype, the second categorization of lesbian poetry was born: modernism. Modernism was birthed as a rejection of early modernist romanticism. Many lesbian authors of the time felt that their sexualities and attractions should not pigeonhole them to fulfilling the societal expectations of what lesbian poetry was. EMR was the only reference poets had before modernism, so lesbian modernist poets were intent on distancing themselves from that genre. In order to achieve the, subverting that label that might have been thrust on them, there was a distancing and restraint forced onto their poetry as well. Lesbian authors had one of two choices, as Bennett explains: either completely stop writing about the sensuality of women, or instead reinvent the diction and style expected so that they could communicate these attractions differently. Poems of this time that still related to the physical attractions between women were far more restrained, often focusing on situational imagery meant to stimulate emotions rather than the vivid, picturesque descriptions. Modernism, however, remains sort of similar to early modernist romanticism due to the emotions that it conveyed and the centric nature of the homoeroticism of the female body and mind. The third period Bennett focuses on is a style of lesbian poetry dubbed poetry of identity politics. Identity politics is a phrase we're hearing more and more these days as the political climate seems to polarize. Similarly to the modern uses in the news where identity politics were birthed of sort of personal attachments to groups, cultures, or characteristics, poetry of identity politics is categorized together based on their ties to feminism and politics. Because many female authors and poets of their time were producing work during contentious periods of social and political reform, feminism and outspoken opinions became a focal point of the poetry written on the basis of identity politics. These poems were often very direct in their meanings of conveying outrage and desire for political activism or change, and almost always had a central theme of feminism. These poems were also seen as the battle cries of women scorned, whether rightly or wrongly. In this case, the direct public outrage through prose forged the public association to feminism with outspoken lesbianism, anger, and often resentment. This public understanding, or sometimes misunderstanding, of feminism based on the artful poetry produced during this period gave rise to sort of the erroneous assumptions that feminist equals angry lesbian academic, or somehow lesbian equals a woman who hates men. Whether these assumptions were applicable to certain authors or not, the modern societal consequences allow for a revisiting of fresh lesbian poets to the style of writing because it provides, again, this outrage based on identity. The last Bennett touches on is post-structuralist or post-lesbian feminist. Similarly to the poems of identity politics, post-structuralist lesbian poetry centers around the personal experiences of the author, but it's instead how their race, culture, gender identity, or sexual orientation has influenced their lives. It's a stylistic portrayal of events, struggles, and or emotions associated with specific cultures and overlaps with the homosexuality of the author. In this way, post-structuralism is ultimately able to be explained as intersectionality almost. The poetry attributed to this style allowed for the potential for an increase of heightened prose style of writing, where a more story-like atmosphere could be created. Based on these periods that Bennett explains as integral evolutions of lesbian poetry, I'm going to take a look at some of the class readings, the first of which will be Kitchenette Building by Gwendolyn Brooks. So Kitchenette Building is a prime example of the poetry of identity politics. The poem exists as a metaphor for the role of women. The prose lingers on dreams, specifically being a luxury for women in ways that maybe they wouldn't be for other genders or ages. The poem communicates the harshness of women's realities, and as they're the ones who typically make sacrifices and are placed last. The final line is, "We think of lukewarm water, hope to get in," is written as an example of how women, and mostly mothers, tend to put themselves last, even to their detriment. Like circumstances, for example, where large families would shower one right after another, leaving all of the hot water gone by the time that the woman gets in to shower. The women in this poem the women that this poem is written for and about are the ones who are put last and suffer, in this case, the routine nature of cold showers, because others are always put first, time and time again. This fits the poetry of identity politics perfectly, as it captures the commonality of unfortunate experiences for women. Whether taken literally, when the audience is, the mother of many, cooking constantly, making sacrifices for her household, or figuratively, where women are consistently undervalued and put last by everybody, the poem speaks to the nature of femininity and the struggles that it produces. Anne Sexton's Sylvia's Death is best analyzed as a product of modernist poetry. There's an obvious nature of romanticism, as the poem's written for and dedicated to one of the most prolific female poets of all time, of course, Sylvia Plath. But the nuances of diction and stylistic technique make this poem fall more squarely under modernism than early modernist romanticism. Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton studied together in college and interacted on deep, meaningful levels, much of that time together. It was later found out after Sexton, the author's death, that she had actually been involved in an intimate affair with a woman, further sort of solidifying her queerness. Examining Sexton's work through the lens of her queerness allows for a further understanding of her poems, especially Sylvia's Death. This structure and diction in this poem supports the distancing from, unrepressed romanticism, because it's much more repressed, and instead fixates on themes of sadness, loss, and anger, while romanticizing some erotic elements of womanhood. The fixation of Sylvia's mouth and the reference to breasts looked at through a lens of Sexton's orientation express a non-predatory sense of lust, almost like a feeling of longing that is just communicated aggressively to the reader. The emotional nature surrounding this poem, compounded with the distancing from sort of flowery language, makes it more modernism in poetry, and it's an effective way to analyze it. Next, I'd like to talk about Adrienne Rich, and more specifically, the reading of her poem, Of Valediction Forbidding Mourning. Rich, as a poet, often portrayed themes of feminism and feminist values. The nature of Rich categorizes her poems as mostly poems of identity politics, as they follow her views of feminism, the female experience, and homoeroticism. This piece in particular is broken into stanzas that become increasingly desperate, at first desperate in terms of demoralizing, as she talks about death and pain, but later desperate in the sense of championing individuality, as a last, hope, a last-ditch effort to become this champion of individuality. In this way, Rich encapsulates feminist values, the recognition that women are forced into places, situations, and, forced to feel emotions that make them uncomfortable, is juxtaposed by the last line, she writes, to do something common in my own way. Here, Rich communicates the connection to other women through their lives, but affords the choice of individuality to herself and others, more promoting these feminist values of identity politics. So moving on to Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is obviously the most easily recognizable poet that we'll talk about today. What makes Plath so special is how she was able to dabble in many forms of poetry during her time as a writer. Her extensive work also means that to use characteristics found in Bennett's periods can occasionally allow for some overlap in Plath's poetry. For example, Plath's poem Lady Lazarus, which we're going to talk about today, is one of the poems that, based on characteristics, straddles the line between sort of poems of identity politics and an early projection of post-structuralism, those last two periods. Because Plath married a man and bore children, the elements of queerness are, perhaps incidental or maybe intentional, but, restrained. But her contributions to poetry as a woman make this class reading a really important connection to Bennett's proposed characteristics of, female poetry and lesbian poetry. The poem Lady Lazarus itself is a really lengthy monologue about suicide and death and depression. The poem encapsulates Plath's suicidal ideations that prefaced her actual suicide. The initial reference to 1 year out of every 10 is a reference to her struggles with suicidal urges, likely from sort of depressive episodes and cycles. The name Lazarus is biblical in nature, referencing Jesus' resurrection from death and comparing it to Plath's own suicidal ideations, where she would come back to life and go back to death, and come back to life and go back to death. The feminist undertones and calling out of the struggles of women lend this poem to Bennett's period of poems of identity politics. The imagery and metaphors relating to Judaism, Nazis, and the German phrase Doktor pull in an element of unique culture of post-World War II Jews, forming a sort of early impersonality that pulls characteristics from the post-structuralist period of poetry, which is sort of intersectionality. So switching gears from my endless ability to speak about Sylvia Plath, we're going to switch our gears into Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. Rather than a traditional poem, this reading was a short story about a grandmother who embodied experiences and lessons about what it is to be female and strong, that often contradict accepted feminist values. The reliance on womanhood, femininity, and ladylikenesss as themes among women show the cultural pressures put on the character grandmother, who can be, can be used to juxtapose these feminist values now. It's due to the evolution of feminism and the definition of strong women that we can actually still apply Bennett's framework for analyzing lesbian poetry to analyze this story by a woman author, with the same form of identity politics that she was talking about previously. While Bennett meant her, analysis to be used under poetry, it works so well as a understanding of readers' projections through their work that I think it's important to apply it specifically to this story. For example, the story uses grandmother's hat as a symbol of femininity throughout. It's worn as a symbol of status. Grandmother feels that physical appearance is what a lady has to offer, and that hat's inclusion and evolution in the story demonstrates the fragility of a femininity based off of physical looks and these characteristics. From a feminist perspective, the repetition of grandmother as fixated on superficial expressions of womanhood is highlighted by O'Connor in a way meant to bring awareness to the absurdity of this. This story uses diction and symbolism in ways similar to poetry, making, a good man is hard to find, an applicable example of identity politics as attributed to feminism by the author. The last reading I feel Bennett's work can best be applied to of our class readings is Marianne Hong Kingston's short story, No Name Woman. The story itself revolves around the way that society and cultures are happy to forget women as it conveniences them. The narrator recounts the moment where her mother told her the story of a long-forgotten aunt who killed herself back in China after birthing an illegitimate baby. The surrounding men raided the house and livestock to shame and punish the woman and her family who would dare birth a child out of wedlock. The mother uses this as a cautionary tale for the narrator to avoid allowing herself to become pregnant, as the shame would reflect poorly on her and the family. This is a really horrific documentation of the persevering attitudes left even today, that women are to be punished irreparably for any malfeasance, even if they were not the only participants. The pressure and expectations thrust on women to fulfill roles created by men is at the root and heart of feminism. This story it specifically intertwines culture and the absence of need for feminism in a way unique to Bennett's idea of post-structuralism. The Bennett reading from Professions of Desire, Lesbian and Gay Studies in Literature provides a fabulous framework for classifying lesbian and queer poets. The 4 periods of lesbian poetry established through her work are easily applied to many of our course readings and, of course, extend far beyond, as I hopefully have very well communicated today. Her categorizing can even be applied further to short stories that tie in feminist, lesbian, and intersectional themes, as reflected in the last 2 short stories we talked about here. The versatility of Bennett's classifications allows for a new lens to be worn when reading and analyzing the works by female and or queer authors in a way that has contributed heavily to these analyses from now on to the rest of time.